All right. And so begins our last unit here for the semester. We're almost done. Got 3 little chapters left, and then we'll spend a good chunk of time going over some concepts so you guys can perform really good on that final exam. We have evolution is the last little bit, the last exam. This chapter here looks at, obviously, Darwin and some of the aspects, components that go into evolution. In the next 2 chapters, the next one and chapter 15, chapter 16, chapter 17 are what they primarily are. I've plucked bits and pieces, so I mean, if you do read the book, that's great. It's fantastic. But I've taken some stuff from some other textbooks, from some science, the Smithsonian's website for some other aspects and some history just from some other scientific sources. So if you're just looking at your notes, you're going to get everything that you need out of it. Excuse me. And I'll be highlighting stuff here with my little pen. Okay. And hopefully, excuse me, you will pay attention to that stuff. But in this one here, this looks at basically what chapter 16 and chapter 17 are going to look into the mechanics of. This chapter sets the stage for what is evolution and some of the components that we incorporate to understand how things change over time. In chapter 16, it looks at microevolution, small changes, and how those small changes can happen. In the last chapter that we're going to look at, it looks at more over, it's called macroevolution, and that happens over millennia. And spoiler, it's hard to see that and witness that. You don't survive a millennia, right? So very hard to see that, but we can look through the fossil record or whatnot, and that's what we utilize as one of the components for understanding evolutionary changes. Everything evolves, everything changes, and this theory of evolution is kind of this unifying theory of biology here, because it helps us to predict how things can adapt when stressed. When we start to look at some of the building blocks for what became Darwin's theory and what Darwin utilized, and even some stuff that we use now that Darwin wasn't aware of biochemistry, wasn't aware of genes necessarily at the time when he was coming up with his theory. So there's some stuff that we utilize now that, he didn't have, or he didn't truly understand. It wasn't really something of common knowledge at the time. So just like anything in biology, more information, more data, you incorporate that in and you can change your hypothesis and you can change a theory after a number of studies and research goes into it. But this is the unifying theory because it does provide us that groundwork for being able to figure out experiments. And we've been looking at, what goes into an experiment since the very damn beginning of the semester. There are a number of various different kind of, the father of evolution is considered to be Darwin, but there are a number of other scientists, and to be honest, some not scientists, that add a little piece to the puzzle that is, Darwin's view of how things adapted and how things changed over time. Prior to Darwin, stuff hasn't changed, stuff hadn't evolved, and by stuff, I mean Earth was only a few thousand years old. Everything is the same. These animals have been here since our recorded history. And that's not a whole hell of a long time. But they've never changed that we've seen. So everything was very stagnant, fixed. This concept of change was not something that could be easily seen. It wasn't until all these explorers started going out and seeing other animals, and for some of them, just the grand size of them, but not necessarily seeing some of these huge animals, but seeing that there's even bigger animals that we have discovered as fossils in the various different layers of the ground through the strata. And once explorers started bringing these back to civilized world, right? They started to question, can this be fixated as a few thousand years old if we have these creatures that are deep, 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 deep down in the dirt in these various different rock layers? Where in the hell did these things come from? Did these things die off and new things just popped up out of the ground real quick? This thing looks very similar to this thing now. So did this thing change into that, even though it's a little bit smaller version? These are questions that people started to ask. And as soon as you start asking questions, everything gets crazy, right? So let's look at some of the history of evolutionary thought. All right. There are a number of individuals that can go in here. I kind of put some of the major ones that are associated with giving a specific kernel, creating a certain avenue through which things could be identified, things could be related to one another. So these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 4, 6. There's like 8 people, okay, that kind of threw a log on the fire of this concept of evolution. And all of these basically go into what Darwin utilized to generate his ideas of evolutionary thought. And it's interesting because, we think of Darwin, but there were other people at the very same time. There was another guy, and we'll mention his name here, that was looking at this very same concept at the same time. It's interesting because this guy sent Darwin his thesis and said, what the hell you think? Because Darwin was kind of the guy. So it's pretty interesting. But let's go back in time. 1735, Carl Linnaeus. Okay. He's one of these early forefathers of evolutionary thought. And not because, through that first bullet right there, believed in the fixation of species. Each species had an ideal structure and an ideal function and an ideal place in life, and they did not ever change from that. So that doesn't really sound like a whole hell of a lot of evolutionary thought. But what he did do is this right here. Okay, it's in bold. Why the hell is my thing not working? There it is. There we go. He came up with this binomial system of nomenclature. We call that taxonomy. He is the father of taxonomy. Okay, he kind of created this concept. It didn't really get until into the mid 18th century somewhere. So several years later that it kind of matured a little bit better and was a little bit more scientific, I guess. But he came up with this system of classification for living things. Okay, that's what taxonomy is. These things are related, so here these guys exist. These have some similarities. These guys exist here. Okay. Yes, there's a few documentaries. And when we get to Darwin here, I'll bring up some of those things that I've recalled from that. Fascinating history. And one of the dudes involved with his concepts of evolution is his dad even. So in 1749, Count Buffon, I mean, come on, he's French. You got to put him in there, right? He was a French naturalist. He came up with this this huge 44-volume catalog of all known plants and animals. He was about 100 years prior to Darwin, I think, if I remember correctly. But he was kind of some of these beginning thoughts of providing evidence of descent with modification. Looking at various different plants, you can see that they're related, and you can see some modification from this plant to this plant. And he kind of a little bit of introduction to this thought, to this idea of descent with modification, which Lamarck took as well. And obviously Darwin and one of his contemporaries at the time also did as well, descent with modification. But what Buffon did was to look at a number of various different factors. Environmental influences. What did the environment do to cause these adaptations? Migration. Migration doesn't sound like something that's huge, but if all of a sudden you have a whole new set of individuals moving into an environment, what do those individuals carry? Not that Buffon or anybody of that era really knew, but when those people come in, what do they bring? Can anybody suggest something that they bring with them that would help drive evolution? Correct. New genes, diseases, hell yeah. Diversity, all of those things, yes. What could help drive evolution? Genetic information. Yes, diseases, but within those diseases that people can carry, they also carry the genetic information to potentially overcome those things. So genes, bringing in new genes adds more diversity to a gene pool. And these are all some of the major things right here, guys, that we're talking about that will drive microevolution, macroevolution, evolutionary mechanisms. These are the things. And Buffon was very ahead of his time in this thinking. Now, he didn't really understand it. There's a whole bunch of mathematical BS and nonsense associated with immigration and migration and death and geographic isolation. It's the struggle for existence. And that is at the hallmark, and that is at the crux of Darwin's theory, is that struggle for existence. It's that struggle for existence, that desire to try to find as much resources as possible. And if you have the better genes, you have the better ability to get the resources, better ability to get the mates. Females if you're a male, males if you're a female. Okay. And it was Buffon that really started this thought for a lot of different mechanisms. He just suggested it. He had no idea what in the hell he was doing. He's French, right? No, I'm joking. All right. James Burnett, 1773. He suggested that humans descended from primates. Yeah. He was looking at characteristics that were similar between primates and humans. Okay. And again, this doesn't seem too much of a leap, but in 1773, blasphemer, right? In 1794, Darwin's dad, that's Erasmus. I mean, come on. You got to put Erasmus in there, right? Just because of the name alone. This is Darwin's dad. He proposed that all warm-blooded animals arose from a single form, common ancestor, descent through modification. And unfortunately, we'll show a little bit of the tree of life here at the very, very end. But being able to see some of these different characteristics in lab would be kind of interesting. And that's one thing we kind of get neglected this semester. George Cuvier, paleontology, and this idea of catastrophism. Old Georgie here, he looked at fossils. He came up with the science. He founded the science that is paleontology, looking at fossils, studying fossils, looking at the extinction of these animals and what that means for animals that are alive today, and comparing them. Comparative anatomy is a huge important thing. Sorry, I keep hearing something. I don't know what's going on upstairs. All right. Catastrophism. I mean, Buffon, right? Struggle for existence. Here with Cuvier, it's these local catastrophes that help to drive movement of animals. When a catastrophe happens in a region, it wipes out a vast number of individuals in that region. New individuals can move in there, repopulate it. And that can have a drastic effect and a drastic change on a gene pool. There was a very interesting article. I think it came out last week. And it looked at, it was these scientists, they were down somewhere in the Gulf. And they were doing there, and every year they go there and they do research on these certain, this very small component of the food chain down there. I can't remember the exact name of the creature that they were tracking and discovering, but it's kind of hard to track in the ocean, this thing, because it literally lives on the surface, the skin of a couple different species of fish. And so every year when these fish come back to do their spawning and whatnot, you know, they'll track them because they are a major component of the food web. And they were able to get all their stuff out right before one of the billion hurricanes, it feels like, that has gone through there this year, came through. And they had to go back in and get some more pieces of equipment. And when they went back in, some of those pieces of equipment were still working. It was still collecting information, you know, still collecting some fish. And for the fish that had come in there that had not been there before, because they were cataloging all the different species, after the hurricane came through, the species of this tiny little creature that lived on the back of these fish was 180 completely different from what was literally there right before the catastrophe. So this idea of catastrophes are a huge driving force when it comes to introduction of species into a new habitat, eradication of new species in a habitat, and ones that were small in number before, all of a sudden, boom, they can skyrocket in number because of that catastrophe. We haven't talked about the bottleneck effect. We'll look at the bottleneck effect, I believe, in the next chapter, is where I kind of talk about that a little bit. The bottleneck effect, guys, for those that are asking, is when the number of species really bottlenecks. Okay, so instead of having all of these number of individuals down here in the pyramid, I have just a handful of individuals up here at the very top at the bottleneck that are able to successfully reproduce because there's only a few of them now. Well, what does that do for the genetic pool? It severely limits the genetic pool. So over time, if you have a very small population, like in cheetahs, it can actually cause them to be so genetically similar that they can't reproduce properly anymore. So, and you get low numbers because of that bottleneck effect. And that's one of the driving forces for microevolutionary change. This idea of catastrophism is a huge thing when it comes to, causing genes to switch frequency within a population to get a little shift for microevolution to occur. So these are some of the basic building blocks for what we're going to be looking at, especially in the next chapter. Oh, everybody knows this one. Where's my pen? There it is. Lamarck came up with Lamarckism. What is Lamarckism? There it is. You should definitely know this one, right? Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. I just like saying these crazy ass names, so that's why they're in here. This guy was really the first biologist to propose evolution. He was able to link diversity with an environmental adaptation. Didn't have it right whatsoever. His is the classic, the leaves are up higher, so the giraffe has to stretch longer, and it's that stretching of his neck that he's able to pass on to the next, and they have slightly longer necks. Wouldn't that be awesome? If all I had to do was like stretch a little bit and I could be taller. Oh shit, that'd be awesome. Proposed where, simple life forms were spontaneously generated. They were driven up a ladder of complexity over time, use and disuse of organs, blah, 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 blah. Inheritance of acquired characteristics. You change your characteristics and you're able to get a change to occur and pass that on. Modern genetics, this is not supported, right? It's genetics, right? So modern genetics help to kind of really disprove this one a hell of a lot more than anything else. But Darwin's theory, totally threw this back in his face. But this was many years, about 50 years after this fact. So this took a lot of time for his information to kind of get out there. I'm going to do something here real quick. I'm going to pause. Thomas Malthus. Sorry. Malthus and Lyell. This dude was an economist. I think this is hilarious. Lyell was an economist that looked at war and how conflict would drive different civilizations to either increase or decrease in number. Okay. So he looked at how times of social upheaval, how that affected the resources and how that directed that civilization to overcome. And by that, we're really mean able to evolve. And I'm using a different interpretation of the word there, but if you are able to overcome something that is difficult, that is an evolutionary mechanism. If you're able to grow and evolve, that is what Malthus was really looking at. And what did Buffon? Struggle for existence. Catastrophism. war, famine, epidemics. What are all of these underlying things involve? The struggle to survive. And what is the real world but the struggle to survive? Those that are able to survive the poop storm, they're able, because they have the genetic information inside of them, to be able to handle famine, war, epidemics, loss of food, maybe upheaval and removal from a location because of some kind of catastrophe. All right. Those individuals who are able to survive are stronger because of it. And this is at the basic core of what evolution is. Those that are more fit, and by fit, I mean able to survive, are able to pass on their genes, and it's those genes that get passed on to the next generation. Darwin used Malthus's concept of economical factors. He incorporated that into his theory of evolution, and it's one of the core principles. Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell, and we kickstarted this thing, what, in the 1700s, 1735 or something like that? Yeah, 1735, and here we are about 100 years later. And now we have Mr. Charles Lyell. And Charles Lyell came up with this concept that the Earth is undergoing a continuous cycle of change. There's some erosion, there's some uplift, there's this cycle that is naturally occurring. And there are a number of these cycles. Okay. Later in the book, if we would have had time this semester, we maybe gone into some of the continuous cycles that happen that, help to enhance erosion and whatnot. I'm trying to find something here. It's it's called The Voyage of the Continents. I'll write it down here for those, because it's on Amazon Prime. When you're on a treadmill and you're doing some steady state cardio and you're bored out of your mind, you can watch The Voyage of the Continents. And it's like, how many? It's only one season. It's like 10 episodes, but it looks at the origin of the land that we have today. So, it looks at, there's a one that looks at Africa, early Africa, later Africa, North America, Central America, South America, Oceania, where the Ring of Fire is, Asia, a couple different ones for Asia, Europe, a couple different ones for Europe. And it looks at how the geography was made, and it looks at continental drift. And, this is one of the concepts that Charles Lyell never really got into, but he looked at the cycles that happen to get those various different layers of strata, and it's uniformitarianism is what he kind of came up with. Rates of change are very constant. They happen at a constant rate. There's certain minerals in the sediment layer at this level. There's a certain number of minerals in this layer. And so by looking at all of those various different layers, he was able to come up with this constant, slow, methodical rate of change. Obviously, this can be thrown into a loop. That loop would be meteorites or asteroids hitting the Earth and hitting the planet at various different times. Obviously, would have sped these things up quite a bit. Okay. The classic one hitting down there in the Yucatan hitting down there in the Gulf, one of the bigger, more asteroid hits that we had on this planet. There's a interesting PBS that looks at it and the discovery of that, and it's fascinating. And how did they prove it? By looking at the various different isotopes and metals within the Earth's various different layers, very similar to this point, to this point, to this point, at all different points around the world. And that's only going to happen if there's a huge asteroid that hit the planet. So pretty interesting there. But that voyage of the continents, it is kind of interesting. It's, I mean, especially if you're bored, but it is a fascinating watch. There's several of them. I even got my boys to watch a little bit of it, and they don't watch anything that's not on YouTube. So after Lyell, now we got Darwin, okay? And you can see right around the time that Charles Lyell was coming up with his concept, Darwin set sail. In 1831, he was hired to be a naturalist, and I think I have that on the next slide. He was hired to go off and make a record of everything he saw, collect samples of various different things. This is where he gathered all of his data and information to come up with his theory of evolution. He studied ecology. He looked at interactions between species and their environment at various different points along his trip. But in 1845, the study of ecology was born, not because of Darwin. But he was able to take this new science of ecology and able to incorporate it into his theory. In 1856, the Neanderthal skull and bones were found in Germany. A human-like creature, very similar to us. Alfred Wallace in 1858, he was the contemporary of Darwin. He came up with this theory of evolution by natural selection as well. And a lot of his findings were very similar to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, we always talk about him and his travels. Alfred Wallace, he did the same thing. He went on a ship and he went in a different direction, but he was able to collect specimens, see fossils, see animals in different locations of the globe. And he was able to come up with all of these concepts of what we think of when we think of the factors that drive evolution. In 1859, Mr. Charles Darwin publishes his book on the origin of species. It's actually like a really long name, but that's the only one that really anybody cares about. On the origin of species. And it was Wallace and Darwin that basically co-authored this concept of what we have come to look at as evolution. Here it is. HMS Beagle. He was hired as a naturalist. He was there to collect specimens, plants, animals, rocks, anything and everything. He was to document. He documented landscapes. A lot of it was for South America, as you'll see on the next picture there. Was able to come back with a lot of different fossils and a lot of different various different animal specimens to add to the collection of the British Empire. And here you can kind of see set sail, jolly old England. And you can see they did a lot of mapping around South America, and that's where the Galapagos Islands, and that's where, we have all of our information today. Okay. But you can kind of see bounced around. There's Wallace. He kind of went up through this little region right here. Okay. Through Oceania a little bit. But 5 years on a boat. Could you imagine that? Boy. That would not be a fun time. But drew extensive pictures, very detailed pictures. There's a few different documentaries out there that have some of his scribblings and whatnot. It's just fascinating the amount of detail that he was able to put into his drawings.